For TRICHOMES.com, I'm Jesse Batend, and this is The High Ground. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. One of the largest consequences of the '94 crime bill was something called mandatory minimums. Basically, it gave courts the right to give life sentences to repeat offenders, in many cases for crimes that never would have received such a long sentence otherwise. The devastation that rule caused, and in some states continues to cause, is hard to comprehend. And while certain politicians say that they've learned from the, quote, mistakes of the crime bill, many of those politicians are still in office, in some cases, even running for president. And at the same time, it's also true that many of those people that they jailed are still in prison. Currently, no state has retroactive release programs for prisoners serving time for cannabis-related offenses. Let's be absolutely clear here. That means that in states that have legalized cannabis sales, the people locked up by that crime bill, quote, by mistake, will continue serving their time, in some cases, life sentences, for something that's no longer illegal. It's true that states like Illinois have issued thousands of pardons, but they've chosen not to make it an automatic process. Andrew Deangelo is the co-founder and treasurer for the board of directors of the Last Prisoner Project. The organization has made it its mission to fight for the release of inmates still serving time for cannabis-related crimes. When Andrew was 9 years old, his older brother, who was a cannabis activist himself, was arrested. I reached out to Andrew to find out how that experience informs the work that he does today, how we got to this moment as a country, and where we go next. Andrew, thank you so much for joining me.
Nice to be with you today, Jesse.
You had a very unconventional family life growing up, and also your brother was a strong influence on you. Can you talk a little bit about how that played out for you?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Talking about how I grew up and my family is one of my favorite things to do. My brother Steve is 10 years older than me, and we had a brother that was in between us named Daniel. And Daniel died when he was 6. Steve was about 12 or 13 when that happened, and I was about 2 when that happened. So that when something like that happens to any family, it changes you, and it has a big impact on the family. Unfortunately, that event also led to my parents splitting up. And shortly after that, my brother left home because he went to join the anti-Vietnam War movement, which soon morphed into his work with legalization. So all of that happened to me before I was 5 or 6 years old, and that makes you want to be close to your family, what's left of it. So I was very close to my parents. I was very close to my brother. I worked very hard to heal my family. We did heal our family. My parents never got back together again. My father remarried, but everybody in my family came to peace with what happened and with our trauma and our loss. And my parents died in our arms at home, when they passed. So it was our family's journey in many respects is instructive, because if not for our relationship with cannabis, a lot of that healing may not have ever occurred. And in fact, there are many, many families who had similar things happen to them without cannabis that perhaps did not have the kind of healing we did. So, and when you lose a brother, and your older brother is as dynamic a person as Steve, of course, you want to grow up to be like your older brother. So that was true in my case. And, I think I did that pretty well. Now, Steve and I are both all grown up. We are our own persons, but we also work together closely on things like Last Prisoner Project, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, and a whole bunch of other projects, both creative and more transactional in nature. And then we also do a bunch of stuff on our own separate. So we have some solo albums we cut, and then, the band gets together all the time and plays too.
It sounds like obviously your brother was a strong influence on you But how did his interests and his sort of early burgeoning activism play out in the household? It sounds like there was some friction between your father and brother.
Oh, yeah. Well, look, my parents were caught up in all the different revolutions that were happening in the 60s. So my mom became a feminist, and that had a big impact on the relationship. My father didn't like that so much. And that had nothing to do with my brother, of course. But my brother was anti-war and pro-cannabis, and my father was an employee of the federal government. My father actually worked for the very establishment that my brother was anti-establishment against. And so,
My God.
So, of course, there was conflict between those two men. And oftentimes, as a little tiny kid, I heard them arguing and fighting, and not just my brother and my father, but my mother and my father and my mother and my brother. And there was a lot of generation gap, tension. The politics of the time was impacting our family. Everybody in the family had a little bit different take on what was going on at the time. My mom wanted to be a free working woman. She wanted to get out of the household and not be a homemaker anymore. My father wanted her to stay in the household and raise the children. My brother wanted to raise hell and overthrow the government. And, I was a little kid just trying to grow up and missed all that. And so, yeah, there was some chaos and confusion for me as a child. And there was some conflict between the adults in the family. And that was, part of the healing I mentioned a moment ago that we had to engage in as a family, that I had to make a lot of sacrifices to facilitate over the years.
Yeah. And you mentioned, I've heard you say that you had a perception that your parents were kind of worried that your older brother was going to turn you into a revolutionary, I think was what you said.
Well, of course, my parents were very protective of me, not just because my brother was going off and being a revolutionary, and they didn't particularly think that was a healthy way to spend a childhood, but also because my other child, Daniel, their other child, Daniel, had passed away, and they were worried that I share a similar genetic condition that Daniel had. That was one of the things that led to his death. So they were very, very worried that I was going to get sick and die too, or that I was going to run away and be a revolutionary too. And so they were very protective of me. Every time I got a runny nose, I was off to the doctor, and they were running the tests and making sure I was okay. And every time, I acted out, they were sending me to the therapist and making sure I wasn't going off the deep end too hard. But I had to sort of survive all of that. And, but my parents were probably overprotective, and I also, sort of went into athletics and sports as a kid to sort of deal with all of that trauma and conflict and chaos and confusion. And that sort of isolated me in a way where the only thing I really knew about and understood was athletics and sports. So the combination of all those things, when I was growing up, I didn't get to spend a whole lot of time with my brother until I was a teenager. When I was a little kid, my mom made sure me and my brother hung out when we were kids, but it was hard. My brother didn't live at home, and I would only see him sometimes once every couple months. We always had the holidays together, and we always had lots of family dinners. My mom, either at my mom's house or my dad's house, we always had that tradition of breaking bread together and having meals together. And so I'd see my brother on those occasions. But once I became a teenager and I grew up a little bit, and particularly when I started smoking weed, my brother and I got very, very, very close. And that's when, I from the very first time I started smoking weed with my brother, I think at the end of that session, several hours and many, many joints session, I think he gave me a quarter pound of weed that I took to my dad's house, and I started selling weed the next day to my friends in high school and the people who lived in my apartment building. So I very quickly I committed to the cannabis trail once that moment happened for me. And then, I was pretty committed to being a revolutionary. And so I guess my parents, protective layers was sort of obliterated in a giant cloud of cannabis smoke. But it all turned out okay. There was definitely some times when my parents were concerned that when I went off to college and I was doing some of the same politics and work that my brother was, I was always a little bit more of a tamer version. I went out to college. I didn't, I was selling weed in the dorms, but I was also studying theater and acting. I was a good student. I got good grades. I was accepted by, other than my advocacy for weed, I was pretty much accepted as a dark sheep, but, pretty accomplished on campus. So, I sort of found my own way after a while, but was able to integrate the creative and the cannabis and and selling weed and activating for legalization, and then starting some of the first legal cannabis companies in the world. That whole journey was sort of something that we were able to achieve by becoming close as brothers and deciding to dedicate our lives to working together and making all of those things happen. It required a lot of sacrifice, and the only way each of us could have achieved what we did as individuals was by coming together. Once we made that commitment, and I was old enough to make that commitment, Steve and we started to have a lot more success as we started working more closely together after I got out of college.
And because of this life that your brother was leading, and the climate that existed at the time, it's not particularly surprising that some of that behavior did end up landing him in legal trouble. Can you talk a little bit about the experience of when your brother was first arrested and maybe what impact that had on you at an early age?
Oh, that very first bust when I was a little kid. Yeah. So my brother's 18, just turned 18, not too long after his 18th birthday. And he was on an airplane from DC to New York, and he had some cash and some weed on him, and they found it. And he got busted. And in those days, this was whatever it was, mid-70s, I guess, early 70s, mid-70s. You went to jail, even if you were caught with a few grams of weed and some cash. I think he had $5,000 or $10,000, maybe a little more than that. And you went to jail. So he went to jail it was his first offense. He'd never gotten busted before, and he was not a person of color, and my dad was still working for the government at this time. And despite all that privilege we had, my brother still went to jail for 5 months. And one of my first experiences on the cannabis journey, my first explicit experience, was when I was 11 years old, and I went to visit my brother in jail. Or no, I was younger than that, 9 years old. And I went to visit my brother in jail. And I remember it vividly because we had to lie about my age. You had to be 10 years old to visit somebody in the jail. And I was only 9 by, a few months before my birthday, I think it was, or it might have been more than that. But in any case, we lied that I was 10, and I got to visit my brother in jail. And not only did I visit him in jail, my brother and I wrote letters to each other when he was in jail. And those letters and that visit to jail, I didn't know it at the time, but was probably the first steps I took on the cannabis journey was that visit and those letters to prison, because I knew I had known for many years before my brother got busted as a little kid what he did for a living. My brother never hid that from me. He was always honest about all of that with me. He always told me that cannabis was good, not bad, and that he was on this mission Even when I was a very young child, he told me those things. So, and I also knew my brother was a loving, generous person who made my life adventurous and fun. And it was really cool to have an older brother like Steve when I was growing up, even though I didn't see him as much as I would have liked. When I did see him, he always took me on these amazing adventures with all these really cool people around. So I knew he was good, not bad. And then I go to the jail, and the jailers are trying to tell me he's bad, not good. And it was very confusing for me, and it hurt me, and it made me angry because I knew it was a lie. And then, my brother would write me letters telling me how the experience was in jail and why he was put there and so forth. And, I learned a lot about what the world is about and what criminal justice and social justice is at a very young age. I learned this at 9 years old in a pretty brutal and traumatic way. And this was, in a family that has white skin with a quite, we weren't uber wealthy people. My dad worked for the government, so he was middle class, but he still worked for the government. We had somewhat of an inside track, and still it was a devastating experience for all of us.
And it sounds like that through that experience, and it's quite possible that you already had some sense of this before, but it sounds like it was very clear to you in that moment that the story that you were being told about cannabis, like you weren't really getting the full story. It sounds like you decided to embrace that and to double down and to say, no, I'm going to fight. But the other thing that sometimes manifests in people, I think, is shame when someone in their family used cannabis during Prohibition. I know even like the Attorney General of Illinois, where I am, talked about her mother using cannabis growing up and like how ashamed she was of that because her perception was that her mother was committing a crime. So there really is like an intense emotional aspect to some of this stuff. Was that something that you struggled with at all? And why did you kind of come out fighting?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because it's easy for me to tell a more heroic tale. But the fact is, I remember actually when you mentioned the word shame, a very vivid memory just came in my mind. And I remember our next door neighbor, when my brother was locked up, I was out in the backyard and I was doing some yard work and I was breaking a sweat. And my neighbor was someone that was closer to my brother's age. He was like an older kid, and I knew his younger sister. Me and his younger sister were very, very tight. And he looked at me across the fence and he said, "Oh, I heard your brother's locked up." Now, I didn't tell him that. I didn't know how he knew that. I had no idea how he knew that. I knew my parents didn't tell him that. And so he must have heard, when you get locked up, people learn about it, right? And all of a sudden, I didn't know what to say as a 9-year-old kid. In fact, I don't, and that sense of shame came over me greatly. I actually remember the feeling. I don't remember what I said to him. I might have denied it and said, no, he's not. I was so shameful. I might have. I don't remember. Or I might have said, something else. I might have said, yeah, he's going to get out soon. I'm not sure what I said, but I remember that feeling of shame. And then I also remember wondering how many other people I knew were going to ask me that same question. But the other part of that shame that you experience is my parents. My parents felt incredible shame. And you could feel it in their body language. You could see it and feel it as a child in their body language whenever they had to deal with going to visit him or talk to me about him or, read letters to me from him or to him, whatever. That sense of shame was absolutely through their entire bodies and spirits, particularly my father. My father had tremendous internal conflicts that was very hard for him to deal with.
So I want to fast forward just a little bit here. You did a lot of work in ending prohibition, and I think we'll circle back to talk about some of that over the course of the conversation. But moving from this early, part of your life forward to your current work with the Last Prisoner Project, where you work to get people with cannabis records expunged or out of prison. Can you tell me a little bit about like the genesis of that particular project, how you got it up and running, and what it kind of looks like today?
Yes. I like to tell the origin story of Last Prisoner Project as a 2-act play. The first act was, we've been trading cannabis for a long time, my brother and I, and certainly we've been busted ourselves pretty badly, particularly my brother, but our friends got busted over the years. So we always had to deal with this, people getting busted and going to prison. And we always had to support those folks in one way or the other. And that might be bailing people out. That might be raising money for a legal defense. That might be helping to raise children when people are away. Whatever the support that is needed, we always try to provide that in our communities. Then when we opened Harborside, we had a program that my brother thought of where if you did not have enough money to get your medicine as a patient, you could write a letter to a cannabis prisoner, and we would, in exchange for that letter, we'd give you a voucher for a free gram of cannabis. And that program generated thousands upon thousands of letters were generated over a 12, 13-year period that program existed. And a lot of those prisoners would get out and they would come to Harborside and they would thank us, and they would, meet the people who had written them. And you would have these, incredible emotional moments where someone would be so grateful that they received these letters from strangers, from people they didn't know. And they would start a friendship or a pen pal relationship with folks. And that taught us a lot about, keeping these lifelines open. So that was sort of the first act of the origin story of Last Prisoner Project. The second act is all about my brother, because, Steve is just one of these people that gets a lot of brilliant ideas. And he was sitting in a conference room right around the time when California was getting ready to legalize cannabis for all adults, and we were going from a nonprofit medical system to a for-profit adult use system. And as you can imagine, those of us who had been in the industry and had some success were taking a lot of meetings with high net worth individuals, and we were finding ourselves in big fancy conference rooms with lots of people who wore designer suits and pocket squares and talking about how we're going to give birth to this industry and how we're going to raise money and deploy capital and scale and so forth and so on. And people were talking about growing, thousands of pounds of weed and making hundreds of millions of dollars. And in the middle of one of those meetings, my brother got a phone call from our friend Chuck, who was serving, I think it was 3 or 4 years in a state penitentiary in Pennsylvania for transporting 14 pounds of weed from California to Pennsylvania. So our friend Chuck, and Chuck is a hippie musician, a mechanic who fixes people's cars. He's raised kids. He's the most gentle, loving person you've ever met in your life. All Chuck wants to do is play his guitar and fix people's cars, raise his kids, and sell a little weed on the side, and take care of his elderly mother. And our society determined that is somebody who should go to prison for 4 years. And my brother got a phone call from Chuck at that moment, and the vision for Last Prisoner Project hit him all at once. And he said, not until every prisoner is set free will we give up this fight. And that's when the whole idea for the nonprofit hit my brother like a thunderbolt. And shortly thereafter, he called me up and said, I got this idea. And, we smoked a bunch of weed and got the whiteboard out and started talking about how we're going to manifest the idea like we always do, always have done, and found some people to partner with, some incredible people, amazing people like Dean Reyes, Mary Bailey, our managing director, Sarah Gersten, our executive director. We recruited Natalie Papillon onto the team now, and people like Eric Murray. And the organization is starting to fulfill its mission. We're getting a few people out of prison. We're launching reentry programs. We've participating every year in the expungement weeks. That's coming up in a week, next week actually. So that we're going to get a whole bunch of other people into expungement, we hope, next week. And Last Prisoner Project, the community's really responded. We're able to raise money. We have programs developed for cannabis companies to participate in. LastPrisonerProject.org. People can learn all about that. And I'm really proud to say that we're bringing in, some donations that allow us to actually get this work started. We're going to need to raise tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. We have 40,000 people that we know of, cannabis prisoners in the United States alone. We want to do this globally. We want every single cannabis prisoner out everywhere on earth. That work could take a generation. I hope not. I certainly hope not. I pray not, but it could. The world's a big place, and prohibition has got its teeth sunk in pretty deeply in certain areas, and it's going to take a while to undo all that damage. But we're well on our way, and I'm super proud of the team. And it's of all the things we've done, this is, I think, one of our most impactful.
For people who may not have been following this whole story over the years, it's worth understanding that some people are in prison for crimes that involved cannabis, but because of mandatory minimum sentencing and some of the laws that came out of the war on drugs, there are other people who are serving life sentences for crimes that involve only cannabis. Is that correct?
Yes, the best way for people to really understand this is to hear some stories. So Michael Thompson, African-American man, 26 years he's been in prison for 3 pounds of weed that he sold to an undercover cop because he had 2 prior convictions for cannabis. He received 3 strikes and you're out sentencing in Michigan, and he has a de facto life sentence. He's 69 years old, and Last Prisoner Project has worked very hard to get a clemency petition through the parole board. I'm reasonably confident the parole board approved his clemency petition. That will get it to the desk of the governor, and the governor can then sign it. And then he will be freed. So we are already working on housing for him. And remember, COVID hit, and Michael Thompson actually got COVID, had to go to a hospital. Thankfully, he's recovered. I think he's recovered. And we were trying to get him out before he got COVID, citing COVID as the latest reason to get Michael out, a person who should never been locked up in the first place. Leland Dodd, locked up in Oklahoma, another 25 plus years. Leland, I think it was 6 pounds of weed in his case. Again, another undercover cop. And Oklahoma decided to make an example of Leland, and they gave him this outrageous sentence because they had passed some mandatory minimum laws, as you mentioned a moment ago, Jesse. And he was literally one of the first people convicted under these new mandatory minimum laws some 25 years ago, and he's still in prison. And this is another inmate in their 60s, if not early 70s. And all Leland wants to do is go fishing on the Arkansas River, which I guess winds through Oklahoma. And that's all he wants to do for the rest of his life. And we can't get him out. We're really having a hard time with his case. So those are two examples of people who maybe they were too poor, or maybe they were too black, or maybe they didn't have a good legal defense, or maybe they didn't have the right kind of family support, or maybe they didn't have the right kind of education, or just good luck. And now they are in prison for life, for weed, for something that's legal in both of those states, at least for medical, and in Michigan is legal for adults. And, this is an outrageous injustice that anybody, I think, anybody listening to the program would agree that we should release people like that right now. No questions asked,
When states first looked at implementing some sort of cannabis program, how is it possible that a state could consider doing something like that without also including a plan to handle the people who are currently incarcerated? Because your organization estimates there's something like 40,000 people currently incarcerated for cannabis. Those stories represent quite a lot of people. And I guess I'm wondering, like, what was the pushback or the justification for not having an expungement program baked into every single proposition that would allow cannabis to be sold?
Well, it's a complicated tale, and it's a little bit different in every state. But one, law enforcement is got powerful lobbies in every state of this nation, and they lobby against it. Number two, our activists don't do a good enough job crafting expungement into the law in the first place. Sometimes we just don't do a good enough job. I think we've learned from our mistakes, and we're getting it included pretty much every time in the future, and certainly at the federal level with the MORE Act and some of the others is in there too. So I think we've learned from those mistakes, but there, some of the first states that flipped, if you had a felony conviction, you were out of the program. But me and my brother got run out of Massachusetts during their first medical program because my brother has a felony conviction. He wasn't even on the application, but the Department of Health kicked us out anyway because there was some bad press in the Boston Globe, and they folded under the so-called media pressure. And that now, if you're a felon, Massachusetts, at least on paper, welcomes you with open arms. But in the beginning, they kicked you out. Okay, so the stigma surrounding cannabis, even when we legalize it, remember, we're legalizing it by and large through voter initiative, which means the politicians are pissed off that the voters did that, and they're not going to be very cooperative. And they're certainly not going to be cooperating to get a bunch of people out of prison that they think should probably be in there anyway. And the cases where, legislatures have adapted it, it's usually been Democrats, and sometimes the Democratic Party just either through incompetence or through risk aversion doesn't do things like expungement, doesn't do things like retroactive release. We don't have retroactive release anywhere. That's something we've been, clamoring for. That retroactive release, what that means is when the law passes, if you're in jail for that crime, you are immediately released. No questions asked. The law has changed. What you did is no longer a crime. You are immediately released. We can't get that. We can't get that anywhere because the politicians in both major political parties feel that is too big a risk for them to take.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut in, but I would ask, how anybody can talk about these bills as social justice measures. Like, how disingenuous is it when retroactive release isn't baked into the plan? You talk about how communities are impacted by prohibition, but you're not going to do anything to fix the the people who are currently being impacted by it. I mean,
well,
is that fair?
No, of course it's not fair and it's not right. But this is a republic we're living in that's disguised as a democracy. A republic disguised as a democracy is a lot better than a dictatorship or a fascist or communism or some of these isms that we are on the dustbins of history. But it's still a very imperfect system. And as you participate in the system, once you get something legal like cannabis, you're not an activist anymore. You're now an operative. And you have to do things like, interact with the major political parties and try to craft frameworks that work, whether it be for legalization, whether it be for expungement and prisoners, whether it be for social equity and righting the wrongs of the past, whatever it might be. You have to convince these mainstream folks that have pretty heavy bias against you in the beginning to trust you and to do what you say is right. And they simply do not. Okay, they simply do not trust us. They simply do not think things like retroactive release or even expungement is the right public policy. And so they craft more measures that create more incremental change. Retroactive release is this big, bold change that's based on justice, truth, and what is right. But that's not how our republic works. That's not how decisions are made. If decisions were made that way, we'd be a lot farther along than we are right now. Decisions are made in a different way than that. And as we learn how to interact with that decision-making process and get better at it, we're not very good at it right now. But once we get better at it, and the moral arc of the universe at a very accelerated rate is bending our way. And so we just have to make sure our ideas are well crafted enough so that when we do get power, they actually work.
I'm going to try and squeeze in two more questions here for you in the time that we have. And you mentioned police and their influence over the conversation right now. And I want to talk about that a little bit because we are clearly seeing the conversation about the role that police should have in society develop in a way that is accelerated and dramatic. And it seems to be on everybody's minds. I also know that when it comes to cannabis, you mentioned the Boston Globe and Massachusetts. The Boston Globe put out a report that in 2019, police made $1.1 million in overtime payments in order to provide security for dispensaries. And this conversation has there's the potential that it spirals out into the many, many issues here because lack of banking means creates a need for extra security. And there's a lot of interconnected issues here. But one thing we're seeing is that current police departments and police officers are making are gaining financial benefits sometimes from legalization of cannabis. And in other situations, retired police officers are starting security companies and getting involved. There are also former police officers who are the owners of cannabis businesses who are getting licenses, in some cases above people who, like you said, have a felony conviction. I know that's a lot to talk about. I guess what I'm wondering is, are there ways that the cannabis community could be working more proactively with activists and with political actors that share some common interests here? I mean, I think the work that Black Lives Matter does, as an example, would be the same people that are interested in that would also be interested to know that police officers are making additional salary with these dispensaries. I feel like I'm fumbling this question, but where do you see opportunities to work with others?
Well, if you're talking about the cannabis community working with groups like Black Lives Matter more and being more active in the change that needs to occur with respect to race in this country, we need to do a lot more than we're doing now, the cannabis community. We need to work with a lot more groups. We need to donate to a lot more groups. And we need to make sure that Black and brown people have ownership. Cassandra Frederique, who is now the executive director of Drug Policy Alliance, said this very well in the film Grass is Greener by Fab Five Freddy, which everybody should see, by the way. If you want to learn about racism and cannabis prohibition, go see Grass is Greener on Netflix. But she said, Cassandra Frederique said, that the remedy for Black and brown people in our industry has to be greater than the harm that was committed against them. And that is the true mission of our industry to that community, to those communities. And I would also say that legacy people like me and hippies and growers and burners and artists and multi-generations of legacy folks, I call them legacy folks, are also have a special place. Not in the same way that people of color do. Our space is different. We didn't suffer nearly as much as people of color did, but we were hunted and imprisoned too. My own brother was, and I was on multiple occasions, and our friends were too. So we have an obligation to make sure that those two communities get to have ownership and participation. And if there's going to be groups that create multi-generational wealth in the cannabis industry, those groups should look like those communities too. So the cannabis industry has that obligation. And, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can make that happen. The activists, the Black Lives Matter activists, the social justice activists, social equity activists in cannabis have done a terrific job the last couple of years, really moving this issue forward. I've learned a lot and have recommitted myself even more to these issues. And I was pretty committed before. So I think we're doing well on that level, but we're just getting started. And, it's so hard to get these changes into the operating system. We've had a lot of great activity in the street, but we haven't had any meaningful police reform or laws passed. And the MORE Act for cannabis, that was the little bone that the Democrats tried to throw us. Now they're screwing that all up in D.C. But I'm cautiously optimistic that we are at least having the right conversations now. Now, I think we also have to build bridges to law enforcement. I don't think it's good for us to be enemies of law enforcement and to keep calling them out as corrupt, even if they are, and they are. It is corrupt to put to make it so it's hard for us to breathe on the one hand, and then on the other hand, make a whole bunch of money from the industry that you fought to legalize. So let's get everything straight, all right? But eventually, we're going to have to build bridges because we cannot continue this way. The only way we can develop one legal market where all of us get to participate and have our space in it is by building the bridges, and that also includes law enforcement. Law enforcement's going to have to come our way a little bit if they expect a bridge to be built, frankly. And we are also going to have to probably recalibrate our expectations a little bit with respect to law enforcement if we expect them to be willing to build a bridge to us. And I'm not sure when that work will happen, but I'm ready to make it happen, and I hope that we can make it happen because it's not good for any of us to have these divisions and this mistrust. But we do need to transform policing, and it's not about reform; it's about transform, and that is a prerequisite to building the bridge for our community. you can't build a bridge if you're getting murdered. You know what I mean? And that's what's happening.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and that kind of leads into, I guess, what would be the final question for you, which is just, we are seeing cannabis become a topic in the presidential election, and presidential politics are always, I think it's fair to say, they've become nastier than ever.
Are we seeing it in the conversation? I'm not sure we're seeing it in the conversation. The two political parties didn't mention cannabis at all during their convention.
Right. And that's kind of where I was going is that it feels like in some ways, you know, the Democrats who have decided in some cases to take up this position for at minimum descheduling, it seems like they're afraid of that position, and they don't quite know how to make an argument that this is an economic engine and just a justice issue.
You know, it's very curious. You've got the voters agreeing with cannabis legalization more than they agree with any other issue. Any other issue polled. And yet both political parties are terrified of cannabis and won't embrace it. And we have to ask ourselves, why? I don't want to pontificate all the reasons that I think why, because there is an election coming up, and, you know, we do have to try to do better. But the progressives and the cannabis folks lost the Democratic primary, and so, you know, the people who did win are trying to do what they usually do and have it both ways with cannabis, and not endorse full legalization, but also not endorse prohibition, and have this like middle ground that is just a middle ground that doesn't really work for us, right? So anyway, that's my read on it. I think obviously the Democratic Party position on cannabis is much more friendly than the Republican Party position on cannabis, but I'm disappointed in both positions on cannabis, and I'm disappointed that we're not in the conversation more. I thought they're so good at ignoring us. I thought in 2016 we'd be part of the conversation because we were on the ballot in 13 states that year or something like that. 8 states, I think it was, just a huge number of states. And I thought for sure the two presidential candidates were going to have to comment on cannabis, and that, you know, there'd be a question asked at one of the debates about cannabis. Nope, didn't happen at all. They both ignored it. So did their debates. And I'm afraid that's what's going to happen this year, too. They've both made their platforms clear. Trump's going to keep, I guess, hands off and let the states do their thing. And Biden's going to decrim and expunge. So, and that's all they're going to say about it, I think, between now and the election. We have a few states on the ballot this time. The pandemic sort of messed up our activism in a number of states. We weren't able to collect the petitions the signatures we needed on petitions during the pandemic. So we had to abandon efforts in several states. But we're on the ballot in Arizona and a couple other places. And you know, I am mystified that the two major political parties don't talk about cannabis more, embrace cannabis more. The voters clearly are with us. It's a very curious question. You'd think people would be tripping over each other to, you know, before Biden got the nomination, we were getting all these Democrats trying to out cannabis each other, and it was great, right? And then we had Bernie Sanders issue his policy, which was terrific. Best public policy on the federal level I've ever seen for cannabis that anyone's ever written. He put out as a major candidate, that's anyone's ever written as a major candidate, he put out. And wow. And, you know, he had some momentum there in the beginning. We thought he was going to win, and we were jumping up and down. But then Biden came back in South Carolina, and, you know, my brother and I knew as soon as Biden got a lot of momentum that our issue, cannabis, was going to be in a little bit of trouble in 2020. Now, our job is to force Biden and Harris to embrace legalization, and we can do that. And they're counting on us to do that. I guarantee you they are. Biden is probably sitting there saying, well, the pharmaceutical companies, and I'm in Delaware, and they've been my friends for a long time, and then, you know, I got law enforcement, and I got to triangulate, and I got to be in the middle, so I'm going to do decrim, and, you know, maybe those cannabis people, maybe the Deangelo brothers will, you know, drag us over to legalization. Let's hope they do. You know, maybe they're having those conversations. So that's our job. And that's what I intend to do, because, you know, in a binary system, I think we do want the Democrats to win. But I say that with so much reluctance, Jesse. I can't even tell you. You know how you have to bite a piece of wood when somebody's like operating on you, and you know it feels like that. It feels like no anesthesia. Here comes the operation. Bite on the wood. So we have to drag them. We have to drag them kicking and screaming. It's going to take a lot of work. We're going to have to do our activism, and we're going to have to do our operative work. And once we do legalize, and our social justice and social equity activists are going to have to keep raising hell and doing a good job that they've been doing. And you know, the fight is on for all of this, and we're going to have to. We'll win some and lose some, but I hope that the frameworks at the state level for legalization will get better. And I hope whatever happens at the federal level will enable our community, the legacy folks, the social equity, the people of color, the folks that have been the stewards of this plant for a long time during Prohibition, that whatever happens at the federal level will allow them to participate and thrive.
Andrew Deangelo is the co-founder and the treasurer of the board of directors for the Last Prisoner Project. Andrew, thank you so much for talking to me.
Thanks, Jesse. Nice to be with you today.
You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground@trichomes.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at trichomes.com and following us on all social media. The show is produced by David Fortin. I'm Jesse Batend, and thank you for listening.